minus 42 degrees Celsius. Without shelter. German civilians trapped between the freezing cold and the final bombings of the war. Let that sink in for a moment. Minus 42 degrees. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes in the air before it leaves your mouth. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare hands means losing skin. And in January 1945, millions of German civilians faced exactly this nightmare with nowhere to hide. This is not a story about soldiers or battles or victories. This is not a story about politics or ideology or the grand movements of armies across maps. This is a story about survival in its purest, most desperate form. About ordinary people, people like you and me, caught in the grip of history's coldest and most merciless winter. People who had done nothing except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. And at the very center of this nightmare stands a woman named Margarete Vogel, 34 years old, a former school teacher from the ancient city of Königsberg, East Prussia. A woman who would be forced to make impossible choices in the days ahead. A woman whose determination to save her family would be tested beyond anything she could have imagined. The morning of January 12, 1945, arrived like a death sentence wrapped in white. Margarete stood at the window of her small apartment on Lindenstrasse, watching her breath crystallize against the frozen glass. The ice patterns reminded her of the lacework her grandmother used to make. Beautiful and deadly all at once. Her hands, once soft from grading papers and turning pages of literature books, now cracked and bled from weeks of relentless cold that seeped through every wall. She shared the apartment with her elderly mother, Helga, 67 years old, who had lived in Königsberg her entire life, and her younger brother, Karl, 28, who had returned from the Eastern Front 6 months earlier with a shattered left leg and lungs damaged by gas. Karl walked with a heavy limp now, using a wooden cane he had carved himself during recovery. His military career ended abruptly when a Soviet artillery shell exploded just meters away, killing 3 comrades beside him. Margaret's husband Ernst had been gone for 18 months now. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, fighting in a war everyone privately knew was already lost. The last letter arrived in September. 4 months of silence since then. 4 months of not knowing whether she was still a wife or had become a widow without knowing it. The radio had been broadcasting warnings for weeks, though authorities wrapped every announcement in layers of propaganda. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, unstoppably. The Red Army had crossed into East Prussia. Reports filtering through from refugees who had already fled were terrifying. Villages burned, farms destroyed, civilians caught in the crossfire or worse. But the Gauleiter of East Prussia had strictly forbidden evacuation. To flee was defeatism. To flee was treason. Anyone caught trying to leave without proper authorization would be shot. Party officials continued speaking of miracle weapons, counteroffensives, final victory. Margarete had stopped believing in miracles months ago. That morning, Margarete gathered her family around the kitchen table. The stove had run out of coal 2 days earlier. The apartment was now nearly as cold inside as the frozen streets outside. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layer upon layer. "We have to leave," Margarete said quietly. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." Her mother Helga shook her head slowly. The old woman had lived in this city her entire life. She had survived the First War, the Hunger Years, the inflation, the rise of the Nazis. Her husband had died in this apartment. Her parents were buried here. "This is our home," Helga said. "Where would we even go? I'm too old to become a refugee." "West," Margarete replied firmly. "Toward Berlin. Toward the Americans or the British. Anywhere but here." Karl sat silently, his damaged leg stretched beneath the table. He had seen things on the Eastern Front he never spoke about, things that visited him in nightmares. "Margarete is right," he finally said. "I've seen the maps. The Soviets will be here within weeks, maybe days. And when they arrive..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. At the central train station, Margarete found pandemonium. Thousands crowded the platforms, desperate for any transport heading west. Women screamed for family members lost in crowds. The elderly collapsed against walls. Arguments erupted over places in lines that led nowhere. A railway official told her the next civilian train wouldn't arrive for at least 3 days. Military transport had priority. Everything had military priority now. 3 days. with Soviet forces advancing kilometer by kilometer every hour. She walked home through streets that grew colder with every step. The sun set at 4 in the afternoon, painting the frozen city in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. That night, temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees. The walls seemed to contract with cold. Frost formed on the inside of windows so thick Margaret couldn't see outside. Helga had developed a cough, deep rattling sounds that emerged from her chest like something trying to escape. At 67, with no medicine available, a cough like that could be deadly. Pneumonia, bronchitis, any number of ailments easily treatable in normal times could become fatal now. "We're leaving tomorrow," Margaret announced. "On foot if we have to." "Mother can't walk to Berlin," Carl said, "and neither can I. Not with this leg." "Then we find another way, a cart, a truck, something." Carl looked at his sister. "You always were the stubborn one." "Stubborn is what's going to keep us alive." That night, for the first time, Margaret heard artillery. Distant still, like thunder rolling across a summer sky. But this thunder didn't fade. It continued hour after hour, a constant rumbling reminder of what was coming. She lay awake in darkness, listening to her mother's labored breathing, her brother's restless shifting. She thought about Ernst, wondered if he was still alive somewhere, also listening to the guns. And in those dark hours, she made a decision. Tomorrow, no matter what obstacles stood in their way, they would begin their journey west. Because staying meant dying. And Margareta Vogel had no intention of dying in this frozen hell. Every week we bring you the untold stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Real history told through real human experiences. Subscribe now so you never miss a story that deserves to be remembered. Join our community of people who believe every life has a story worth telling. January 13th, 1945. The thermometer outside the baker's shop showed minus 40 degrees. The baker himself had fled 2 days earlier, leaving his ovens cold and shelves empty. Margaret had spent the night packing. Not everything. There was no way to carry everything, but essentials. Warm clothes, as many layers as they could wear and still move. Whatever food remained. Identity papers. A small wooden box containing family photographs and her grandmother's wedding ring, the only items of value remaining. Carl had managed to procure a handcart from a neighbor who died of pneumonia. The widow accepted a bottle of schnapps in trade. In these final desperate days, liquor was more valuable than gold. Helga sat on the edge of her bed, watching her daughter pack with eyes that seemed to see beyond the moment. Her cough had grown worse during the night. "I'm slowing you down," the old woman said. "You and Carl should go without me. I've lived my life." Margaret stopped, crossed the room, sat beside her mother, took the thin, cold hands in her own. "We leave together," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Or we don't leave at all. That's not negotiable. You gave me life. You raised me. I am not going to abandon you now." Helga's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good daughter. Better than I deserve. I'm exactly the daughter you made me. Now save your strength." The streets of Königsberg had transformed overnight. What had been a trickle of refugees yesterday became a flood. Thousands upon thousands moved through the city, all heading the same direction. West, away from the guns. Margaret pushed the handcart with all her strength, while Carl limped alongside, using his cane to test each step on icy cobblestones. Helga sat atop the cart among their bundled possessions, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The roads were clogged beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Farmers from eastern villages who had finally defied evacuation orders. Townspeople from communities already fallen to the Soviet advance, their faces carrying the 1,000-yard stare of those who had witnessed horrors. And everywhere, the abandoned. Suitcases too heavy to carry, dropped in snowbanks. Furniture families had desperately tried to save, now blocking roads, and occasionally, bodies, frozen solid where they had fallen, too numerous to bury, too heavy to move. They reached the first checkpoint around noon. Nazi officials had established a barricade, checking papers, turning back anyone without proper authorization. Margaret's heart pounded as they shuffled forward. She had no authorization, no official papers, nothing but a story and desperate hope. The young official who stopped them was perhaps 22, with the pinched face of someone given a small amount of power and determined to use it. "Evacuation is not authorized," he announced flatly. "Return to your residence." "The Soviets are 50 kilometers away," Carl said, his voice carrying the edge of a man who had seen too much to be intimidated. "What instructions do you think are coming?" The official's face reddened. "Are you questioning the orders of the Reich?" Margaret stepped between her brother and the official. Anger rarely accomplished anything, but sympathy, properly applied, could open doors. "Please," she said, softening her voice. "My mother is very ill. My brother was wounded serving the fatherland. We just want to reach family in the West. Surely there must be some provision." The official hesitated. Behind him, the line stretched back for kilometers. People were growing restless. And then, as if fate itself had intervened, aircraft engines filled the sky. The bombs fell without warning, Soviet aircraft targeting roads clogged with refugees. The first explosion threw Margaret violently to the ground. Snow and dirt and something wet rained down. The world became chaos. Shriek of engines, thunder of detonations, cries of wounded and dying. She couldn't see Carl, couldn't see her mother. The handcart had been knocked over, possessions scattered. "Mother!" she screamed, but her voice was lost. The attack lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When planes departed, Margaret pulled herself up and began searching. Carl was alive, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, bad leg twisted beneath him, but alive. And Helga. Margaret found her lying in a snowbank 10 meters from where the cart had been. The old woman's eyes were open, staring at the sky. Then Helga blinked, coughed, looked at her daughter. "Well," she said, voice barely audible. "That was unpleasant." The checkpoint no longer existed. The young official who tried to stop them was gone. The road was cratered, littered with debris and bodies. But refugees continued to move. There was nothing else to do. Stop and die. Keep moving and maybe live. A young woman named Frida, perhaps 25, attached herself to their group. Her entire family had been killed in the bombing. She had survived only because she stepped away from their cart moments before the planes came. Frida didn't speak, just walked alongside with hollow eyes, but her presence was oddly comforting. Another person to share the burden. An elderly professor walked with them for hours, speaking eloquently about the history of East Prussia. Then, without warning, his heart gave out. He collapsed mid-sentence. They didn't have strength to bury him. They kept walking, leaving another body for the winter to claim. As darkness fell, temperature dropped to -42. They couldn't survive the night in the open. They found shelter in a ruined farmhouse, partially destroyed by artillery. The roof was gone on one side, but 3 walls remained. Nearly 30 refugees crowded into the small space, sharing body heat. Carl built a fire from broken furniture. They huddled around it, Margaret and Carl and Helga and Frida. 4 survivors among millions. Helga's cough had grown worse. Margaret held her mother's hand, feeling how thin it had become. "Tell me about the summer you met Ernst," Helga whispered. Margaret closed her eyes, reached into memory for a world with sunshine and warmth. It was 1932. The music was playing. Ernst asked me to dance. He was so nervous he stepped on my feet 3 times. Helga smiled faintly. "He was a good man. Is a good man. Yes, he is." Neither spoke the fear that hung between them. If this story is touching something deep inside you, leave a comment below. Just write, "I'm still here." Your engagement helps these forgotten stories reach more people who need to hear them. Morning arrived with brutal indifference. 3 people among the refugees had not survived the night. An elderly couple from Allenstein, frozen in each other's arms. A middle-aged man whose name no one knew. Helga's lips were blue, breathing shallow. "Can you continue?" Margaret asked gently. "I don't think I can walk. Not today. Maybe not anymore." Carl appeared, face grim. The Soviets broke through another line. They're advancing faster than anyone expected. "How close?" "Close enough to hear tanks by nightfall if we don't keep moving." They reached the Friesches Hof as darkness began to fall. What lay before them defied imagination. A frozen expanse stretching to the horizon, white and featureless, populated by thousands of dark figures moving across its surface. The ice groaned, a deep, unsettling sound that seemed to come from everywhere. Bonfires dotted the surface, marking safe paths. Between them, the shapes of those who hadn't made it. Wagons broken through the ice, bodies frozen where they fell. "We should wait until morning," Frida said, eyes wide. Carl pointed to the eastern horizon. Artillery flashes. Much closer than yesterday. Aircraft engines somewhere in the darkness. "We go now," Margaret decided. "We stay together, follow the lights, and don't stop until we reach the other side." The crossing would haunt Margaret's dreams for the rest of her life. They walked in darkness lit only by distant bonfires. The ice beneath their feet creaked and groaned with every step, constant reminder that nothing separated them from frozen water below. Carl went first, testing each step with his cane. Margaret pushed the cart. Frida walked beside Helga, ready to help if the cart broke through. Around them, thousands made the same journey. Some moved in organized groups following guides who knew safe paths. Others wandered alone, and some didn't move at all. Margareta passed bodies frozen to the ice, past abandoned carts, past holes where wagons had broken through, dark water visible beneath. "Keep moving," she said, over and over. "Keep moving." 3 hours in, the planes came. Soviet aircraft, flying low, engines roaring in darkness. Then bombs fell. Explosions erupted across the ice, sending columns of water and ice fragments into the air. The frozen surface cracked, fissures spreading from each impact. Margaret threw herself over the cart, covering her mother. The world dissolved into chaos. When planes departed, the path they had been following was gone. A massive crack had opened, stretching for hundreds of meters. On the far side, bonfires still burned, refugees continuing their journey. On this side, perhaps 100 people remained, cut off. "What do we do?" Frida asked. Carl was already moving, limping along the crack's edge, looking for a place to cross. "There," he called, pointing. "The crack is narrower, maybe 2 meters. We can bridge it." They found boards from an abandoned wagon, laid them across, a makeshift bridge that might or might not hold. Frida crossed first, then Carl, boards bending beneath his weight. Then Margaret, pushing the cart with her mother aboard. Halfway across, the boards began to shift. "Don't stop!" Carl shouted from the other side. Margaret pushed with everything she had. The cart lurched forward. Behind her, boards gave way, disappearing into black water. They collapsed on the ice, gasping, crying, alive. "We made it," Helga whispered. "We actually made it." But the far shore was still kilometers away. They walked through the rest of the night. The cold intensified, reaching depths that seemed designed to kill. Margaret stopped feeling her feet around midnight, stopped feeling her hands. She walked because walking was all that remained. 1 foot in front of the other. Carl collapsed twice. Each time Margaret and Frida helped him up. Each time he continued, and Helga somehow stayed alive. The old woman who shouldn't have survived kept breathing, kept watching. As gray dawn brightened the sky, Margaret raised her head and saw it. Land. Real land. Not ice. Solid ground. They had crossed the Frisch's half. They had walked across a frozen sea in the middle of the night, under falling bombs, over cracking ice, and survived. Not everyone had been so fortunate. Thousands of others lay beneath that ice now, claimed by the frozen water. But Margaret and her family had made it. Their journey, however, was far from over. The Frische Nährung was a narrow strip of land, a sandbar covered with pine forests that separated the frozen lagoon from the Baltic Sea proper. In peacetime, in summer, it had been a place of natural beauty where families came to vacation and children played on sandy beaches. Now it was packed with refugees, a river of human misery flowing westward along its entire length. Tens of thousands of exhausted, frightened people moved slowly toward the ports where ships supposedly waited to carry them to safety. No one knew for certain if the ships existed. No one knew if there would be room for everyone. But the alternative was staying behind. And staying behind meant death, so they kept moving. Carl's leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, angry red streaks spreading from the wound site up toward his thigh. Infection had clearly set in. Perhaps even the beginnings of gangrene. He needed medical attention that simply didn't exist anymore, needed rest that circumstances would never allow. But he kept walking, kept limping forward, kept refusing to become another body left by the side of the road. Helga hadn't spoken since they reached solid ground. She lay on the cart with her eyes open, but those eyes seemed to see something far beyond the immediate world. Something distant, something waiting. That evening, in a clearing among pines, Helga suddenly became lucid. "You need to leave me," she said, voice clearer than it had been in days. "I'm dying. We both know it." "Mother!" "Listen to me." Helga's hand gripped Margarette's with surprising strength. "You were always the strong one. Even as a little girl, promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll survive this, not just the next few days, but everything after. Promise me you'll find Ernst. Promise me you'll have a life with happiness and love. I promise. And promise me you'll remember. Remember Königsberg. Remember our family. Remember all of this. So someday, when the world has forgotten, someone will still know what happened here. I promise, Mother. I'll remember everything." Helga closed her eyes. Her breathing steadied. She died during the night, slipping away so quietly Margaret didn't realize until dawn. They buried Helga in a shallow grave among pine trees, frozen ground too hard for anything deeper. Carl carved a cross from a branch. Margaret stood by the grave for a long moment, remembering. Her mother's hands teaching her to knead bread. Her mother's voice singing lullabies. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I got you out of Königsberg. I got you across the ice. I'll keep my other promises too. I'll survive. I'll remember. I'll live for both of us." Then she turned and walked away. The living had to keep living. 4 days later, they reached Danzig. Hundreds of thousands of refugees converging on the same few ships. Carl's leg had grown worse. He walked in fever haze. Frida remained with them, finding purpose in helping this family survive. They waited in line for 2 days. The city was bombed twice. On the second night, a naval officer walked through the line. He stopped before their group. "Wounded veteran?" "Eastern Front," Carl managed. The officer nodded. "Come with me. Hospital ship with space for wounded soldiers and their family." The ship was called the Hamburg, a cargo vessel converted for refugees. To Margaret, it looked like heaven. Carl was taken to the medical area. A doctor declared surgery necessary to save his leg, but he would survive. As engines rumbled and the vessel pulled away from dock, Margaret stood on deck watching Danzig recede. Everything she had ever known was behind her. Her home, her city, her mother's grave. But she was alive. Carl was alive. Frida was alive. And somewhere maybe Ernst was too. The ship turned westward. Margaret watched the sun set over the Baltic Sea, painting water gold and orange. She had kept her promise. She had survived. Now she had to find a way to live. 3 months later, in Hamburg, Margaret received a letter from the Red Cross. Ernst Vogel, prisoner of war camp, release pending. He was alive. They reunited on a gray morning in June. Ernst stepped off a train, thin and haunted but alive. They met on the platform, didn't speak, just held each other. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm still here. Your mother? Carl? Carl is here. His leg needed surgery, but he survived. He'll walk with a limp forever, but he's alive." Margaret paused, feeling the familiar weight of grief. Mother didn't make it. She died on the road, a few days before we reached the ships. But she got us through the worst of it. She held on long enough to make sure Carl and I would survive. She made me promise to find you, to be happy. And will you be? Happy, I mean? Margaret looked at her husband. At this man she had loved since that summer dance in 1932, at this man she had feared dead for so many months. She thought about everything they had lost. Their home, their city, her mother, their entire previous life. But she also thought about everything that remained. Each other, the future, the possibility of rebuilding something new from the ashes of the old. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "But I'm going to try. We're going to try. Together." Years later, when the war was long over and Germany had been rebuilt from the rubble, Margaret would visit a memorial erected for the victims of the Exodus. A simple stone monument bearing hundreds of thousands of names, though many more names would never be known, their owners having disappeared into the frozen wilderness without a trace. She would stand before that memorial every January 12th, the anniversary of the day they fled Königsberg. "I kept my promise," she would whisper to the stone, to the sky, to the spirits of all those who hadn't survived. "I survived. I found happiness. I remembered, and I made sure others would remember too." Between January and May of 1945, approximately 12 million German civilians fled the advancing Soviet forces in what became the largest mass migration in European history. They crossed frozen lagoons in temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees. They walked hundreds of kilometers through snow and ice. They sailed on overcrowded ships through waters patrolled by enemy submarines. Hundreds of thousands did not survive. The exact number will never be known. Their bodies lie in unmarked graves along the refugee trails, in the depths of the Baltic Sea, in the ruins of cities that no longer exist on any map. But millions did survive. Margareta Vogel was not a real person, but her story represents the experiences of countless real people. Ordinary women and men who found extraordinary strength when everything they knew was being destroyed. Teachers and farmers, students and grandparents, all forced to become refugees, all fighting to survive against impossible odds. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not for political purposes, not to assign blame or demand sympathy, but simply to acknowledge the human cost of war, the suffering that exists on all sides of every conflict, the remarkable resilience of ordinary people when pushed to extraordinary limits. -42 degrees Celsius, without shelter, trapped between the freezing cold and the final bombings of the war. This was their reality. This was their survival. This is their story. And now, thanks to you watching until the end, their story will not be forgotten. If you watched until here, it's because this story touched something deep inside you. It's because you understand that history isn't just dates and battles. It's real people facing real suffering and finding real courage. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Every single week, without exception, we bring you the untold stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances. Real history, real humanity, real survival. These are the stories that textbooks forget, but that deserve to be remembered forever. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real and deep, hit that like button right now. Your like isn't just a number. It helps this video reach more people who need to hear these forgotten voices from history. It helps ensure that these stories continue to be told. And if you know someone who appreciates history told through human eyes, someone who understands that behind every historical event there were real people with real fears and real courage and real love, share this video with them today. These stories deserve to be heard. These lives deserve to be remembered. This history deserves to be preserved. Until next time, remember, in the darkest winter of human history, when temperatures dropped to -42 degrees and bombs fell from the sky and death seemed inevitable, ordinary people found extraordinary strength. They kept walking when walking seemed impossible. They kept hoping when hope seemed foolish. They kept loving when love seemed the only thing left to hold on to. Their stories are our inheritance. Their courage is our inspiration. And their memory is our responsibility. Thank you for being part of this important journey with me. See you in the next story.